Our first reading this morning is from Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The word of the Lord.
And Psalm 29, a psalm of David. Ascribe to the Lord, you heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The glory of the God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon leap like a calf, Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the deserts. The Lord shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forests bare. And in his temple all cry, Glory! The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as King forever. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. The word of the Lord.
So there's this old fable, maybe it's not an old fable, but it's a fable that gets told every now and then. And I think the purpose of the fable is to give us a perspective on the idea of truth, of reality and perception. And you may have heard this fable before. The fable goes something along the lines of there's this elephant. And a handful of people who are blind or blindfolded are brought to the elephant. And one person who can't see holds the trunk of the elephant and says, oh, so an elephant is long and skinny and snake-like. So that's their understanding of what an elephant is like. Another person holds the leg of the elephant and says, no, an elephant's not like that. An elephant is big and round and strong like the trunk of a tree. That's what an elephant is like. And another person standing at the side of the elephant touches the side, the stomach, the ribs of the elephant and says, no, an elephant is like a big wall. An elephant is big and solid and flat and, slightly curved. But another person standing, at the other end says, no, an elephant is something that, doesn't smell very good and keeps hitting me in the face like a flicking tail or something. So everybody thinks that an elephant is different. So they have these different perceptions of what an elephant is like. And I think the idea behind that is often that the person telling the story wants us to understand that, truth is relative. Truth is, depends on who is perceiving the situation and who, what the situation is, what the circumstances are. So truth can be relative. So, there's such a thing as an elephant. But, for some people, an elephant is like a snake. And for some people, an elephant is like a leg. So that's the point of the story. And I think it raises a good question because we do bring our perceptions, we do bring our experiences to things that we encounter in life that we wonder, okay, is this true? What is the real situation here? The two Psalms that Ken and Lise read this morning. I love these two Psalms. I absolutely love looking at them side by side because they're both written by David. They both begin with the words, a Psalm of David. So they're both written by the same guy. They're both talking about the same God. They're both talking about the same relationship that David has with God. But they're just like, they're mirror opposites. What they say about God are completely different. And you could easily come to these two Psalms and say, well, he's not talking about the same God, obviously, because one of them is nice and one of them is like wrecking the place. So it's easy for us to come to these two things and say, he's got this like weird split personality. Like we don't even know who he is. How can we understand who God is? When we look at these two Psalms, they're both scripture. They're both written by the same guy. But they're describing completely opposite behaviors and personalities. David is described in the Bible as being a man after God's own heart. He was described as being the one who best understood God, as best a human being could. And David's perception of God contains these two opposites. So we're just going to walk through these two Psalms step by step, side by side. And yeah, perfect. And we're going to take a look at, what was going on in David's mind. How did he come to write these two almost contradictory poems about God? Because, Psalm 29 is a psalm of boasting and power and awe from our perspective, whereas Psalm 23 is a psalm of quiet trust and confidence. Psalm 29, and I thought this was kind of interesting, some people think that Psalm 29 is actually like a riff. It's a takeoff on a Canaanite poem that somebody wrote praising their god, Baal. But David took it and said, oh yeah, I want to bet my God's bigger than your God. And he took Psalm 29 and he turned it into a praise to Yahweh to contradict this other Canaanite poem. I find that fascinating, but geek moment. So the Psalm 29 is maybe even just like an in-your-face challenge to another group of people far away. But Psalm 23 is personal. Psalm 23 is my experience. This is my life, and this is what I have found to be true. Psalm 23, is a psalm about peace in the middle of trouble, that the world is a mess, but God walks with me through the mess. In Psalm 29, God is making the mess. He is making the mess that we need peace to walk through. Psalm 23 is individual. It's something that someone would sing themselves. Psalm 29 is something that would be sung in public in the temple to the people, or the people would sing it together to each other. Psalm 23 is a whisper. Psalm 29 is a shout. So I just want to sort of do a study as we walk through Psalm 23 and Psalm 29 in parallel, just to see sort of what was going on. So let's start with Psalm 29 right at the beginning there. And my translation says, give credit to the Lord, O mighty ones. Give credit to the Lord for his glory and strength. Give credit to the Lord for the glory we owe his name, and worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. So David is writing about something he knows because he is a king. David has received splendor and glory. David has worn coronation robes and a gold crown, and he has marched in front of the people of his nation with every eye on him. He knows about splendor and glory because he is a king. At the same time, David writes, the Lord is my shepherd. There's nothing I lack. He lets me lie down in green pastures, because David was a shepherd. David spent his growing up years and his young adulthood understanding vulnerability, understanding gentleness, patience, the need for calm and rest, and what it's like to serve out of sight of any other human being and to simply be quietly doing your job. So David was a king and he was a shepherd. In Psalm 29, David writes, "The voice of the Lord is over the waters," and the waters represented chaos and everything bad and nasty and unknown. "The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, and the Lord thunders over the mighty waters." David understands about the voice of authority. He understands the voice of command because he has had that voice. He has been the one sitting on a throne and saying, "Jump," and having the person say, "How high?" on the way back down. David knows what it is to say, "Bring that person to me," and to have that person brought to him. David had that voice of authority and that voice of power. He was a commander. But David also writes, "He leads me by quiet waters." Not the raging waters, but now the quiet waters. He leads me by the quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yes, David was a commander. Yes, David had the voice of authority, but David also understood what it meant to lead. Not just to tell people what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and when they were allowed to stop. David understood what it meant to set an example. To know that, yes, every eye is on him. That he is in sight and in earshot of the people who are relying on him. Knowing that when they see him behave a certain way, they're probably going to imitate that. David understood what it was to be a leader and a commander. In chapter 29, David writes, "The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedar trees. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the desert. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forests bare. And all in his temple cry, glory." David understood power. He understood destruction. David was a warrior. David was a fighter. David had participated in destruction of what needed to be taken down, of using power to get what he needed to get. He understood what it was to carry a sword, to go into battle, carrying a gun, and to use it. David was a warrior. But David also wrote, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." David had been a warrior, but David had also been a fugitive. David had been a victim. David had spent years on the run, running for his life, dodging the bullets that other people were shooting, and hiding and waiting and waiting and waiting. David was a bereaved father. He lost at least 3 children that we know about. One of his children was an innocent victim of David's own failure. One of those children was murdered in an act of revenge, and one of those children was lost in battle as a consequence of his own arrogance and foolishness. David was a warrior, and he was a victim. David writes in Psalm 29, "The Lord sat enthroned at the flood. The Lord sits enthroned, the King forever. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. And the peace that David is talking about is a peace of stability, a peace of completeness, a peace of wholeness, and a peace of enough. David was a builder. He knew what it was to give strength to his people, to provide for his people. David established the borders of Israel and defended them. He established Jerusalem as the capital city. He laid the plans for the great temple that would be the center of worship for the Jewish people for generations and generations and centuries. David set the example of stable government so that people in his lifetime could live lives of peace, lives of provision, lives free from fear and free from the upheaval of hostile invaders. David was a provider. He was a provider who in Psalm 23 wrote, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." David was not just a provider, he was a recipient. He received all the good that God provided to him personally throughout his life. David was also a worshiper. David understood that his relationship with God was not, equal. That God was great and that he deserved our honor. He deserved our obedience. He deserved our respect and our love. David valued spending time in the house of the Lord, which for David would have been the tabernacle that they built in Jerusalem as a home for Israel's worship. David would have spent time there praying and singing, teaching and leading people in the ways of God. He understood the value of time spent with God because David was both a provider, a builder, and a worshiper. No matter how much tension there seems to be between these two portraits of God, no matter how opposite they appear, I think it's really significant that they end in the same place. Both of these psalms end in a place of peace. Both of these psalms end in a place where God has provided, where God is present, and that we have that shalom peace, that whole provided peace. David was a king, he was a shepherd, he was a commander, he was a leader, he was a fighter, he was a victim, he was a comforter, he was a mourner, he was a builder, he was a worshiper. And if all that is true of one human being, it can certainly be true of the God who created us. We don't have to see these two psalms as being contradictory. They are parts of a whole. And we can't see that whole. We can never see that whole picture of God. We can never understand his entire self. But that's our limitation. That's our blindfold. That's our lack of understanding of what an elephant is. Some of us will come to God and say, "Oh, well, God is, like a trunk." Or God is like God is like the... Okay, well, no. God is God. God is greater than we can understand. He is greater than the portrait that we can put together in our minds. We can only focus on one part of the elephant at a time. But that's our limitation. That doesn't say anything about the truth of who God is. It just means that we are doing our best in this life with the information and the senses and the intellect that we have to come to an understanding of who God is. Sometimes we struggle with that. We struggle with the tension that we perceive between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is a genuine struggle for a lot of people. And it's one that, if you get into a conversation with somebody about this, honor that and take it seriously, because it is something that a lot of people struggle with. The perception of the Old Testament God alongside the perception of the New Testament God. And very often the Old Testament God is seen as being mean and judgmental and violent and vile and misogynistic and all these nasty things. Whereas, we look at the portrait of Jesus as we see God portrayed in the New Testament. And the portrait of God that we see in Jesus seems very different. It's like God has changed his mind about some things, that God is becoming a nicer person. And again, that is not, those two images are not contradictory. If you have an Old Testament understanding of God and a New Testament understanding of God, those two are the same God. We see some of that, glimpses of that in some of Jesus' life. We see that Jesus, he walked through wheat fields with his apostles. I love that image of they're just walking through the wheat field and they're breaking off heads of grain and they're eating the seeds and crunching and probably, talking with their mouths full and laughing and Jesus is guiding his apostles in green pastures where they are provided for. Jesus also stood in a tossing, rocking boat, soaking wet to the skin in a storm that threatened to sink the boat. And he just stood there and his voice of command said, "Stop." And it stopped. Jesus was a commander. Jesus took time to sit quietly with people who had questions, people who were struggling. And he helped them to understand what they needed to understand. Jesus was a leader. When Jesus was in the temple, he turned over those tables that were in the court of Gentiles. He struck a blow for those who were being excluded from a place of prayer. Jesus was a fighter. And there are so many examples of the ways in which Jesus provided. He comforted, he healed, and he raised people to life. One of my favorite scripture verses. I just blew my mind the first time I saw this. I just thought, oh my word, that's so awesome. One of my absolute favorite scripture verses is in Revelation. I believe it's Revelation chapter 1. The Apostle John is in exile. He's been imprisoned for his faith. He's largely alone, isolated from his believing brothers and sisters. And he's praying one day and he has a vision. John has a vision of Jesus. And the details that John puts down on the page are probably his best attempt at understanding this amazing, amazing glimpse into eternity and to who Jesus really is. But one of the things that John says is, in his right hand, he held 7 stars. So Jesus is holding 7 stars in his hand. I mean, picture that. He's holding 7 stars in his hand. And coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. And John writes, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. And then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid.'" This hand that is powerful enough to hold 7 stars is also gentle enough to lay on the shoulder of one who is afraid and who has fallen in fear. This mouth that contains a sword of truth, a sharp, double-edged sword that is going to just bring justice and truth to the world. As you continue to read through the book of Revelation, this mouth it contains a sharp, double-edged sword. The same mouth, the first words it says are, "Don't be afraid." This is the tension in which we hold Jesus, because he is the one who holds the stars. He is the one with the sharp, double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. There's this song that I like by a guy named Derek Webb, and I don't recommend all of his music. I'm not sure if you'd connect, but he's got this one line in this one song. He talks about Jesus being in a bulletproof car so that everyone would be safe from the man who tells the truth. Jesus is in a car that is bulletproof so that everyone is safe from the man who tells the truth. Now, Derek Webb is very cynical about a lot of things, but his picture there is that Jesus has to be contained within bulletproof walls because he is going to speak truth, and it is going to impact the people around him. And Jesus needs to be cut off so that we don't have to hear that truth. This is the kind of tension that we often encounter when we're looking at the Old Testament and at the New Testament. We're trying to reconcile what seem like opposites, but they're not opposites. They are simply shared characteristics of a God who is capable of holding all of that within himself and still being true and right and loving and gentle and good.